The greatest fear that Malcolm posed to the United States of America after his transformation, as we know, Malcolm reinvented himself more than one time. You have the Malcolm X, then you have the El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. These are different transitions, and not only in action, but in philosophy and ideals. When Malcolm came back, he said Islam is the solution to the race problem in America. That's a deep dive, saying that we are actually being hoodwinked. We're actually being controlled through the element of racism, you see, which is no more than an illusion. Imagine if the white American would have begun to look critically at Islam, not as some black revolutionary revolt against white America, but the spiritual dimension that exists within humanity of bringing everyone together, then the whole dynamics of his movement would have changed. And that was one of the greatest fears that they didn't want to happen. That's why even when you read today about Malcolm X, you're still reading about a black nationalist.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. And welcome to Islamic Oasis Live. As always, brothers and sisters, we try to bring you some of the most interesting topics that need to be discussed, that we want to present in front of the Ummah. Sometimes neglected, sometimes on purpose, not discussed, just due to their political correctness, or sometimes just how sensitive the things are going on around us. And so many people, sometimes even podcasts, they stay away from those topics. Like since what's happening with situation in Gaza, or now Sudan, India-Pakistan situation, or Pakistan-Afghanistan situation. And we have always tried to bring you people from the ground, people who know they're in the know-how. And today we have a very interesting topic and a very interesting personality, Imam Sheikh Muhammed, who has been with us before. He is the author of many books. One of them we discussed with him last time was I Buried Malcolm, which is inshallah, a book that you guys actually were very interested in and you read, which is very rare because we don't get the insight of people from, let's say, who are on the ground. Today we have another topic, which is the real reason for killing Malcolm X rahmatullah alayh, also known as Malik al-Shahbaz rahmatullah alayh. The assassination of Malcolm X rahmatullah alayh we have read the books. There's been obviously movies done on this. There's a lot written, but really we still don't get the real reasons to why killing of such a personality that was becoming a very major figure within not only the intellectual struggle, but also, I think, civil rights struggle, or even struggle around the world. He was becoming a prominent figure in many ways. So to discuss that, we brought back our Sheikh Muhammed ibn Hisham Jaaber, a little bit on his background, which mashallah is a lot, because, and we wanted somebody like this, somebody like our Sheikh here, so that, because the book is it may be considered controversial even by some, because of the amount of details that are in the book that will come out very soon, bi'iznillahi ta'ala. Again, let's go back to the background of the Sheikh. First of all, welcome to Islamic OASIS, Sheikh. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for...
Jazakallah khair for coming. Let me just give a brief introduction again. The Sheikh is forensic historian with special interest in Islamic and African and American history as it pertains to indigenous Muslim affairs. In 1978, he received an Islamic Ijazah teaching certification from Darul Iftah Educational Agency of Saudi Arabia in late 70s. He is also son of late Hajj Hisham Jaaber, who performed the final funeral rites for Malcolm X in 1965. Alhamdulillah. He recently released a second edition of his father's account of this life-changing event, I Buried Malcolm. Sheikh Muhammed Jaaber works in the capacity of lecturer and imam in New York and New Jersey. which we recently had the honor to be at the masjid. He's also the author of Color Me Muslim, an autobiography of his life experiences growing up Muslims in Jim Crow South, New York City, and abroad in the Muslim world. His books has inspired thousands of Muslim youth, giving them hope and courage in times of despair. Currently, he is the executive director of BIMA, Bureau of Indigenous Muslim Affairs Incorporated. He is the best known for the unrelenting pursuit in the preservation of Islamic history. Again, Sheikh, welcome back to Islamic Oasis. Sheikh, let's begin this discussion, which I'm sure will be written in history. To be honest, I think this is it will be a very interesting discussion. The book is written. First of all, why this book, Sheikh? Why is that important that this book be written, especially in today's circumstances?
Yes. First, the selection of the title, Why Malcolm Was Really Killed, is not a question. It's actually rhetorical. It's a statement because of the numerous books and information that has been made available. We should know the reason why Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz was assassinated. However, the general public is still unaware of it. It's still in the conspiratorial framework. So I think it's time to bring closure with the disclosure of information that has been concealed for many years. I think we have those resources available to us today. So I think as a Muslim, it is our right to actually rescue Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, aka Malcolm X, from the misconceptions about his life as a Black nationalist, a Pan-Africanist, an anti-Americanist, a hate monger, and put his legacy in its proper context of a Muslim. So and the reasons that led up to his death, I think is very important from the perspective of a Muslim to articulate that narrative in this day and time.
Sheikh, let me start. There's when Malcolm X returns from the Muslim world, a lot is changing on the ground here in the U.S. First of all, why is it a threat, Sheikh, that Malcolm X is now in the Muslim world and he's visiting the Muslim world? Why was that taken as something of a problematic for many people in the U.S. and those who were surrounding him?
Yes. First and foremost, we have to look at the background of the Nation of Islam and its structure from the very inception. The Nation of Islam advocated segregation and separation of races inside of the U.S. of America. And this type of agenda ran parallel with Jim Crow legislation, meaning that they was advocating the separation of races. So this control factor was being promoted and supported, by very, very influential entities inside of America. So when Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm, goes abroad and he actually reaches an epiphany of realizing what he knew to be true from before, he come back with a different position on the social justice movement, meaning that he had broken the mold of racism, nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and he has joined the global universal social movement for justice. And that created a problem within the very infrastructure of the Nation of Islam, who had actually been funded to promote segregation and racism. So that was one of the first problems that he actually encountered in regards to the infrastructure and the framework of the Nation of Islam.
Sheikh, let me ask you again, this may be a controversial question here. Today, many movements are founded and then they are destroyed at will by what American government does. We know that from COINTELPRO and many books and things that have been written. Would it be safe to say that Nation of Islam itself was put together in this country for a certain reason, to keep, let's say, the African Americans away from real Islam?
I think that it ended up in that manner. I think that what happened, as we know, Islam, there's a misconception that the Nation of Islam is the rebirth of Islam in America, which is definitely a misnomer. However, when the Nation of Islam began to ascribe to Black nationalism, which actually is a revival of the Marcus Garvey movement, I think that it was something that America could tolerate. The very framework of this movement could tolerate, because it was advocating the same thing that, the Jim Crow legislation, the segregational legislation was advocating as well. So it posed no threat. It was an advancement. So I think that once that was realized, the support came even from white supremacist groups. They were so adamant about making sure that the Nation of Islam was able to sustain itself that they actually funded the organization. And when Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz began to, I would say, go beyond, the protocol, because he viewed the social justice movement as an unconstrained movement that involved all people. However, the Nation of Islam had a stance of apolitical. They didn't get involved in any politics, any civil rights movements, things of this nature. So that was something very favorable to America at that particular time.
But Malcolm X was very political, Sheikh. I mean, he actually, I think, became famous due to his political stance.
That is a very important point. The reason why the Nation of Islam was very apolitical. However, Malcolm himself broke protocol. As you can recall, when one of their members in California was actually killed by a police officer, Ronald Stokes, Malcolm himself responded with a team of NOI Nation of Islam members to actually resolve that situation, to actually get involved at a level of, even if it included some form of violence, wherein Elijah Muhammad, he actually ordered them to stand down. So you can see that Malcolm's agenda sometimes did not run parallel with the initiatives of the Nation of Islam. Upon the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm himself said it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost, when he was reprimanded for that, and he was silenced for that. In fact, he never came back into the Nation of Islam after that event. So what I'm saying is that Malcolm's political agenda sometimes conflicted with the protocol and the restraints that was established by the Nation of Islam.
So, Sheikh, I mean, who were the political movements at the time that, okay, so the question begs then, was Nation of Islam created to keep the blacks apolitical?
Based on Malcolm's own evaluation, he said that the Nation of Islam was able to recruit some of the most militant black men throughout of America that would be willing to give their lives for social justice and equality in the society. And however, there was no actual response to any type of social injustice that was afflicted upon the 22 million so-called Negroes at that particular time. There were other movements that was politically active, nonviolent movements like the Civil Rights Movement, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. We had movements like Marcus Garvey still had residue. We had the Socialist Workers Party. There was RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement. There were various movements that was going on at that time that was politically savvy and engaging in the social construct of America. However, the Nation of Islam had the members. They had the most charismatic leader of our time on the front line, but yet he was actually in the straitjacket of the Nation of Islam protocol. So yes, so Malcolm felt restricted, and many times he would actually engage without the permission of Elijah Muhammad. Even when Fidel Castro visited America in the 60s, he was refused any type of accommodation in some of the elite hotels in New York. So he ended up at the Teresa Hotel in Harlem, where Malcolm was able to make his way to have a 15 or 20 minute set down with him, which was something that was actually rejected by the Nation of Islam. So Malcolm had a different agenda from what we call the structured layout for the Nation of Islam.
Here's a question here. How was you kind of went on to the question I wanted to ask regarding the meeting between him and Castro. I'll come to that because that's I'm sure that was a very interesting meeting here. But let's go back to the assassination itself. You said, so the question comes, why does the author believe, or you, why do you think, Sheikh, and why do you believe that focusing solely on the triggerman misses the target?
Yeah.
But so I guess what I wanted to ask is that we know, fine, there was a role of NOI on this, and of course FBI played a very big role in this. But you go on to say that CIA itself was monitoring him. I was reading some of the parts of the book that they were obviously his phone was tapped. They knew where he was. I'm sure they knew who was following him. But someone can ask, CIA does not get involved in local operations like this. One can say the FBI, but you're saying that no, the CIA itself wanted him silenced.
Yes, we're going to start with the top, with the CIA. Of course, the other lower levels of law enforcement agencies also wanted out.
And NYPD also, you go on to.
So we're just looking at the CIA itself. We have something in our constitutional law called the Logan Act, and that is an unauthorized citizen negotiates on behalf of a country or America for this particular case without authorization, and also speaking negative of some of the policies inside of America. As we know, Malcolm himself, he traveled abroad, and he also spoke at the Organization of African Unity at that particular summit. And he was given a window to talk about the conditions of America and so forth and so on. And we have to realize that America was coming out of World War II. Africa was going through decolonization. So the world was split in two halves, democracy and communism. So the communist Russian, Chinese agendas were actually soliciting allies inside of the African continent. At the same time, the US of A, United States of America, was soliciting allies and support groups inside of Africa as well. And Malcolm's involvement in abroad was actually exposing the hypocrisy of America. We were promoting democracy abroad, but we was actually upholding Jim Crow legislation at home. So it caused a lot of the African countries to reevaluate or to rethink, should they ally with America when injustice is so rampant there. And also in 1962, the United Nations all agreed that apartheid in South Africa was unconstitutional. It was a human rights violation and so forth and so on. So Malcolm drew the parallel. If all the nations can look at the injustice of racial segregation and discrimination in South Africa and can condemn that, and America is running on those same parallels, why they cannot condemn the racism and injustice and the illegal segregated legislation that was being levied towards the blacks here in America. So Malcolm himself became a big threat because he was actually causing the African states to rethink allying themselves with the U.S. of America.
Sheikh, what is what is the intellectual background of Malcolm X? I mean, for him to pick up all of these things, was there someone else also? I mean, there were people, I'm sure, of same backgrounds, of people of political, and he's thinking beyond his time. I mean, there is a lot that's going on. He's able to, obviously, he's an amazing speaker, and then he knows what political steps to take to also check or on America itself. So give me a little bit of background of Malcolm X. We know, okay, fine, he was from NOI and some of his readings and stuff like this, but what makes him Malcolm, Sheikh?
Really, Malcolm had a very unique background. A lot of people see Malcolm coming out of the prison system in 1952. And from that, his launch pad was the Nation of Islam. But we have to realize that his family was Garveyites. They was already seasoned in revolution. Their minds were already open for those type of dynamics. And also Malcolm was surrounded by people, even when he was incarcerated, who was actually being incarcerated because of their involvement in the social justice revolution and so forth and so on. And they were also Muslims from the persuasion of the Ahmadiyya that were inside of the prison system that Malcolm had contact with. So what is misunderstood, I think, in the American educational system, Brother Muhammad, is that when you live in an environment such as I grew up in Jim Crow South, the education is outside of the classroom. The education is in the culture. The education is in how we interact in the social environment with one another, how human beings treat one another. So we were well aware of that type of negative energy that existed. Malcolm just had to read and actually be able to articulate that in a language that he could actually express it to a people that could comprehend it. But he was nurtured in those type of environments. And as we know, water seeks its own level. And just understanding the social struggle here, the limitations of trying to get justice in the state courts or the federal courts. As Malcolm always mentioned, the fox and the wolf, they have the same appetite. So he could not see himself acquiring the level of justice that was needed inside of America. So that compelled him to go abroad. And he saw people there that was actually resolving their problems through the revolutionary and ideals of change inside of the society. So Malcolm education, I think, would be grafted from his environment, his experiences, his upbringing. And of course, no one can actually capture the real human experience of living in a society when you are dehumanized, like Jim Crow legislation. You can't get that from the universities. You can't get that from textbooks and so forth. So Malcolm is a living experience of his knowledge.
SubhanAllah, Sheikh. So, and then I get today, Sheikh, today's education, do you consider that the education of, or can I guess people who want to seek change today, would they have to do the same? I mean, is the education in the classroom or is it in the culture? And if it's in the culture, Sheikh, is today's culture ready to provide or produce Malcolm X or the type of men like Malcolm X? It's just because the environment is the same in many ways.
I think that the answer to that question is that most of our education institutions are orientational institutions. I think that the information is limited. We don't have any other reference, any other models to draw off. If we want to make change inside of the confines of the 50 states, we don't have a model to draw off of because, as we know, the very foundation of the society was based on conquest. It was based on servitude, subjugation, and oppression. And I think, we have to realize that the victors write the history, and everyone is orientated upon that history. People like Malcolm are unique. They're outside of what we call the box. They're outside of the frame of what we call the foundation of a patriotic American person. And of course, people are aware that these people exist, but they actually make a concerted effort to circumvent them, to make sure that their voices are silenced or they're never heard, because they don't want another Malcolm to come up to expose them for the injustices prevalent and still systemic in our environment. And so they actually pick and choose. Malcolm was just a unique personality who actually, they didn't think that he would rise to that level, a person with an 8th grade education on record. However, he was given a platform when he came out. The Nation of Islam was a platform. As you know, Malcolm was running from his horrific past, from his, the death of his father, from his mother being, committed to an insane. So Malcolm was running from a horrific past. He actually knew the direction, but he was trying to avoid all of that. So, but he had a unique position placed in front of him, and that was the Nation of Islam. Malcolm himself was not really connected to the theology. Very seldom you heard him talk about the theology that they advocate. He wasn't concerned with that. And of course, you can very seldom hear him mentioning Farad Muhammad, and that theology they advocated. His platform was a social justice platform. He needed a platform to strike back at the injustice that had been levied directly towards his family and what the 22 million so-called blacks was experiencing at that time. So he had a unique platform. There are many people who still share that mind state, who still retain that history. But like I said, Malcolm did not have a model for change until he traveled abroad. He realized.
Is that? I'm so sorry. Go ahead. Continue.
Go ahead.
No, I guess what I'm saying, there was Sunni Islam was present at that time. I mean, your background, I mean, your parents' background, you yourself, I mean, you were there. Your dad was the one who conducted the janazah for Malcolm X, rahmatullah alayh. And then, so there is a movement present. I think at that time it was called, I mean, there are a few movements, Darul Islam movement, and there are movements that are out there, Sunni Islam, but why the disconnection, Sheikh, that he couldn't get to Islam here in the US, he had to go back, or he had to go overseas?
Yes. No, it's a very good question. The organization or the movement that I'm a recipient of is called the Adinullah Universal Arabic Association. That organization was conceived in 1936. It was chartered in 1938 by Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, who acquired his Islamic scholarship from Al-Azhar in the 30s. Okay, he is actually one of the co-founders of the Moorish Science Temple. His name at that time was Lomax Bey. He defected because of Drew Ali's claim to prophethood and things of this nature. So he went and he came back with true Islam. Now, our organization was actually monitored and surveilled by FBI. We have right now in our presence 617 declassified FBI files on our organization. So it shows you from the very inception that the law enforcement agencies tried to actually silence these movements, to limit their growth and so forth and so on. So that was one of the reasons why there was a disconnect, because it was very difficult, to work through a Judeo-Christian society, as a person of color, advocating Islam as an alternative to the democracy that we was faced with at that particular time. As I mentioned earlier, the Nation of Islam was given, they was given a green light. They was given leeway. They was given permission because they was actually advocating a narrative that was consistent with segregation. So that's how Malcolm rose to the status that he was, because he was given that leeway. Imagine 10 years he's preaching hate on the soapbox in Harlem. He's talking about the white races are racist devils. He's talking about a violent movement as a retaliation for social injustice, and no one touched him. Okay, he was.
This is very interesting. I mean, because Sheikh, what you're saying today, I mean, can someone draw a parallel and say some of the people that we see today, some of the some of the celebrity imams, and I mean, do you think that it's the same game, just different, as they said, same bottle, different drink, or whatever the saying is? Is that, I'm drawing a parallel because it's very interesting that they did allow him to do so much.
A person of my tenure, I've been, I'm 70 years old, and I've been around from day one. So it's very clear for me to see that the same thing is reoccurring, that we have what we call now a moderate form of Islam that's being really downplayed to actually create a mass assimilation to reduce Islam, not as it is known to be a holistic, to comprehend and compensate the entire life of a human being, but to reduce it to just a religion, a mental or a personal expression that does not involve change within the environment, And I think that this is what was happening with the Nation of Islam. They was given, permission to advocate segregation and so forth and so on. And those people was actually trying to broaden their expression of Islam as it was given to us by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. We had all of the tools that we needed to actually establish an Islamic society in South America, but it was rejected by the society. And I, again, just remind you of Jim Crow legislation. Anything that was not pro-American, it didn't have to necessarily be Islam. There was anti-communist, there was anti-Catholic, there was anti-immigration. Anything that threatened what we call the quote-unquote democracy based on white principles in America was something that was subversive. Okay. And even the term militant was equivalent to terrorist today. So we was going through a lot trying to actually maintain our Islamic identity, to try to maintain our institution without any federal funding, without any type of government assistance. We had to use our own dollars and cents to maintain our institution, wherein the Nation of Islam was being funded heavily by people like H.L. Hunt, who was actually an oil baron who gave them, tons of dollars to promote their situation. Even the Ku Klux Klan, what we know is a white supremacist racist organization in America, had an alliance with the Nation of Islam not to bother them. They could actually move freely in those areas in Jim Crow South without any harm coming to them because they advocated the same agenda. So there's a lot of factors that we have to look at with the Sunni Muslims and how they were restricted and so forth. And Malcolm himself did not realize the level of restriction until he came back from the Middle East, when he came back advocating the Shahadah, correct belief and understanding about Islam. Then he really began to see how the Nation of Islam was their care child that they nurtured and made sure that it was unharmed until Malcolm began to expose the falsities of their teachings.
I mean, I'm sure there'll be, if Nation of Islam, someone from Nation of Islam is hearing this. I mean, obviously the organization exists today and it's there. Sheikh, what is the role of Nation of Islam today? If that, is, because, someone can say, but look, Nation did play a huge role in many people accepting Islam and to come to Sunni Islam. But they had that background, they went through Nation of Islam. Can someone say the Nation of Islam is playing that role today also?
All right, let me address that. That's one of the I think is a misnomer, as Malcolm said. If it had not been for the Nation of Islam, then Islam in its true sense would have spread it. You see, it would have spread it. So we have to look.
That's very interesting.
The Nation of Islam, did it inhibit the growth and spread of Islam? Because a person like Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, once he actually changed his position, he still had the same charisma and had the same attraction. And the Nation of Islam knew that if he was able to continue, it would have destroyed their infrastructure, that the people would have defected from the Nation of Islam to follow Malcolm, because it wasn't necessarily the theology itself that was holding them bay. It was the movement itself. So when we say the Nation of Islam is instrumental for people coming into Islam, yes, it's an echo, but they have to go through so many transitions. You have to look at the 1930s to the 1975. You're talking about, this is when Imam Wahid Muhammad was able to actually make the transition for them. Imagine if that transition was never on the table. If we had started out in the 30s with that type of momentum, you see where we would have been with our institutions, our education, our economics, and so forth and so on. So what I'm saying is that now all of a sudden, but you have to be able to separate the Nation of Islam from Islam. And Malcolm himself have letters of regret. He said he would not cease until he undo the harm that he did. Malcolm, inside of the eye of the storm, saw the inhibits what the Nation of Islam inhibited and restricted the people from becoming a Muslim. And we know that if we had that level of organization, we would have received a lot of support from our brothers and sisters, abroad. And that was the biggest threat. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, Islam itself is it's an alternative, and most people look at alternatives as threats. You see, and by it being misunderstood and miscategorized, we have to actually start from zero again by educating the people about Islam. Another thing that a lot of people miss, like we're going to close on this, is that the civil rights movement was supported heavily by Jewish organizations, financially. And of course, as you know, Malcolm stance was contradictory to that of the civil rights movement. Malcolm did not embrace the idea of turning the other cheek. He believed in self-defense, which they considered violence. If you're trying to defend your own life, the American government said that was a violent response. And of course, as we know, the civil rights movement being heavily funded by the Jewish organizations, and Malcolm coming back as a Muslim, and of course, after he did the report on the Zionist logic, showing his displeasure for the Zionist state in Israel at that time when he visited the camps there was a lot of irons in the fire that was against Malcolm rising to fame as he did in the Nation of Islam.
Sheikh, I mean, okay, there's another parallel today when we see. I remember having this conversation with you that we don't see that type of, let's say, activism for Gaza within the African American community. And this came up in the last discussion that we had regarding the book, regarding the book that we were discussing. Does that still play the role, Sheikh? That why, even though the struggle is the same, even though the kind of oppression that you see, obviously, is a whole different level, but it's there. I mean, years of going through tyranny. I mean, you yourself been through Jim Crow. I mean, lynching of men. All of this apartheid in many ways, and then we have this genocide. But for some reason, I mean, is it by design that it has been kept away from, struggle within the, we don't see the African Americans kind of take that as a same struggle that they went through.
Yes. Again, we go back to the civil rights movement and the supporters of the civil rights movement. And even when Malcolm was actually advocating social justice from the grassroots level, the Black churches was against Malcolm. They wrote petitions against Malcolm. They said that Malcolm's agenda, his platform would be a disaster to not only the civil rights movement but to the American people at large. So there was no support then for that particular movement. And like, again, you have to understand, when we look at the Black churches, they are very influential in the political arena, as far as today. Yes. So when we talk about Gaza and the genocide and the human rights violation at a wholesale level there, it is the influence of the Black churches who actually has the final say as to whether the African American community should engage or not. Because we are still circumventing the innocent people who's being slaughtered there, who's being exterminated there, and we're just putting the tag of a terrorist organization called Hamas on the top, and that's the stopper there. So we have to remove that stigma that this is a war against Hamas and call it for what it is. It is a genocide against the Palestinian people, and until the people realize that, then there will be no actual movement concerning that. And again, we have to look at the Black churches and their stance on that, and what are their Jewish counterparts.
But Sheikh, that would mean that or the Black churches would have to deny the kind of suppression and oppression they themselves were going through. I mean, was the church trying to deny these realities that, look, we are going, the racism that existed, the kind of events that were taking place on the streets of Harlem or New York or, Jim Crow South, were they denying it? I mean, especially churches are, most common churches, as far as the size of them, are in the South.
Well, the civil rights movement was a nonviolent.
Understood, but Martin himself was a preacher. I mean, he preached. He was I don't know the name for. He was a priest, wasn't he? That
he was a preacher. He was actually a yes, but he was a very strong advocate of nonviolence, and of course, even upon Malcolm's assassination, he looked at it as a tragedy. He didn't put any merit in his death and in what Malcolm was trying to accomplish. One thing we have to realize that, after the smoke is cleared, people are trying to rewrite that history, people that is far removed from those experiences. And they are trying to remove those injustices that was actually prevalent in that society. Even Dr. King himself, at some point in the civil rights movement, began to break protocol. Even the FBI considered him to be a socialist because his ideas of economic empowerment did not match the capitalistic structure that we was faced with today, and how the injustice of America was giving land grants to immigrants that was coming in and supporting their development in those areas. By the same time, they was neglecting those so-called Negroes who had no resources to rebuild their societies. So we cannot look at Dr. King at the end as being a strong advocate of the methodology of the civil rights. He himself felt at the very end of his life that the civil rights movement did not produce, the type of results that they had anticipated, and that racism and social injustice still maintains as we can experience it today. So the black churches, as I mentioned, was supported by the Jewish organizations. And of course, as we know, Israel is a state. This is a Judeo-Christian society. They have more affinity with that biblical narrative than they do with the Muslims. And of course, as we know, after the demise of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s, we actually had our backs turned to the world, and we have not been able to regain any type of stability as a community, as a nation since then. So we're very vulnerable to all of those accusations and indictments that come into our lap, and we can virtually do very little within inside of the political arena because we are restricted. And that's one reason why Malcolm wanted to take what we call a launch into the United Nations, because he knew that he could not acquire the level of justice that was required for equality for his people here.
Sheikh, the meeting, let's go now down to the meeting that took place with Fidel. Of course, Fidel being in Cuba, calling for communist revolution. Malcolm X, he's Muslim. He understands. At that time of the meeting, was he Sunni Muslim, or he was still with NOI?
It was with the Nation of Islam.
Okay, so was the nation concerned that he could be influenced by communism at the time?
The Nation of Islam was very anti-everything and pro-black. In fact, Malcolm was reprimanded by Elijah Muhammad for actually having that meeting. He saw it as a threat.
He himself.
He felt that, engaging with foreign leaders was a threat to their stability here in America. He felt that the Black Americans should build their own separate institutions apart from other entities and ethnic groups throughout the world. And of course, Malcolm himself, that particular meeting is iconic, because we saw that Cuba was able to gain a level of victory, over a superpower. America was a superpower. Cuba one time was exploited by the United States of America, and by it allying himself with Russia, it gained some stability, an ally. And I think these types of things was very threatening and eye-awakening for the American justice system, because if Malcolm was able to articulate that our success would have to be acquired outside of the borders of America, then of course the issue of allies would be put on the table, and that could have been detrimental to control 22 million Blacks who was looking for an alternative lifestyle in this society. And again, Elijah Muhammad did not endorse, and like I said, if you don't actually put the script to the picture, you would not be able to articulate what was actually being said. And again, Fidel Castro, he was communist, and America was we was in the height of the Vietnam War, stopping communist expansion and things of this nature, stopping the growth and influence of communism inside of Africa. So Malcolm coming to with Castro, America didn't know which direction the Nation of Islam would go in. That's why they monitored Malcolm from the time he came out of prison up until his last breath. You see, and they had also began to monitor the Nation of Islam even before Malcolm joined it. So it was just a national security concern with any subversive movement, any movement that did not agree with American ideals. And you could not, at that time, as a person of color, comprehend or articulate why a society that advocated democracy would treat one segment of its citizens, less than human beings. It was something we had to wrestle with. And of course, a drowning man that grabbed a sword, as we know. So we were looking for a way out. And Islam is as our belief, our faith, our conviction, but we needed, physical tools to actually manifest these ideas. And that's what Malcolm was. He was a threat that sooner or later he would find the proper tools to manifest the ideals of Islam.
So you're saying meeting with Fidel was more of him still searching that what he had was not enough?
No, it was.
What was his? I don't know if he's ever written on Che Guevara, for instance. Che was there, and he once the Cuban Revolution kind of gained success, and they got what they wanted out of Cuba. There were people like Che Guevara who were in Africa, like Uganda, whatever it was, those areas that he's going in. Do you think that there were African Americans in this country that were looking up to what people like or revolutionaries like Sheikh were doing in Africa?
No, I don't think that movement. I don't think they could identify with that. We had some socialist organizations like RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement. They had a socialist platform, but they weren't connected. There was a big gap between the physical revolution and the ideological revolution. I think that what the Americans was doing, the revolutionary Black American was doing at that time, they was looking for templates and ideas to actually replicate right in America without any actual association involvement with those revolutions that was going on outside of the country, when Malcolm was actually closing those gaps. He was closing those gaps. So and again, we know that, we know the damage that socialism did at that particular time. We know, it was actually just the left hand of colonialism, as we saw, capitalistic democracy when it went and the countries actually had to sell themselves to the capitalistic investors. So there was no real solution for the problem of oppression, because we have social oppression. We also have economic oppression. And this is one of the deprivations that caused the so-called, African American to be at a stalemate in the 21st century, because after the Emancipation Proclamation, there was no actual monetary resources given to them to reestablish themselves as productive citizens in the society. And of course, we're still struggling with those aspects today. We still await reparations for those hundreds of years that the ancestors worked, for nothing and literally nothing to get back, on our feet. So there's a lot that is crammed into the 60s and 70s and the Malcolm phenomenon that has not actually been written properly by those people who was actually involved in the revolution. Most of the people that writes about the history of the Black American, the civil rights struggle, so forth, are mostly people in the universities that actually never had any hands-on experiences with that. And I say that because as a historian and a recipient of the oldest Islamic institution in America that was founded in 1936, that when I hear people from the university level talking about the history of Islam without actually consulting the actual living progeny of those institutions and personalities. So there's a pick and choose, and there's a silence that is still prevalent inside of the Islamic narrative in America today.
So, Sheikh, when we think about Malcolm X today, again, of course, there is still so much. There's a question here talking about why did. There seems to be so many different views on assassination of Malcolm X. Someone can, like you're writing, why did they really kill him? Because I want to make sure that the people know that this is the real discussion here, is that, of course, there's a lot around this that we are talking about, but what's the concern that Malcolm X was going to connect? Because you're talking about 60s and 70s. And at that time, you also have, this time is very revolutionary time across the world. You have Iran situation it was being built in that area. Then you have Afghanistan situation was coming along. There was a lot that was happening. Sheikh, if you compare that time to the time today, do you think that the way Malcolm is discussed, if you can kind of put that together for me, the way Malcolm is discussed today in the society till today, is that to keep that relationship between the Muslims still kind of separated? If you know what I mean. It's like subhanallah, Sheikh, it's like we still, the immigrants in this country still don't know Malcolm X. They don't. I think I can almost maybe guarantee that if I go to an imam in the masjid and I talk to him about, if I go further than just Malcolm X, the name, they have no clue who really he was.
Let me address that. That's a very, very interesting point you brought up here. The greater fear And let us look at this real in depth. The greatest fear that Malcolm posed to the United States of America after his transformation, as we know, Malcolm reinvented himself more than one time. You have the Malcolm to the Malcolm X, then you have the El Hajj Malik Shabazz. These are different transitions, and not only in action, but in philosophy and ideals. The greatest fear, see, white America at that time was also disgruntled. They was looking for a change. They was also impoverished by World War I and World War II. Okay, and certain states in America, the Black American was more progressive than white Americans. So this is why we had the uprising of hate groups, because they was under the impression that the blacks were taking their jobs, taking their resources, and so forth. But even white America was looking for a paradigm shift in the society. So when Malcolm came back, he said Islam is the solution to the race problem in America. Right. If you look, that's a deep dive saying that we are actually being hoodwinked. We're actually being controlled through the element of racism, you see, which is no more than an illusion. And if Malcolm was willing now to spread his wings to work with other social justice organizations. Imagine if the white American would have begun to look critically at Islam, not as some black revolutionary revolt against white America, but the spiritual dimension that exists within humanity of bringing everyone together, then the whole dynamics of his movement would have changed. And that was one of the greatest fear that they didn't want to happen. That's why even when you read today about Malcolm X, you're still reading about a black nationalist. You're still reading about a Pan-Africanist. You're still reading about a violent anti-American a radical. You see, because they have not, been in the inner circles like my father was privy with the transition of Malcolm. And Malcolm would actually alter his agenda on a day-to-day basis, because as he was learning about Islam, he was discarding those things he thought that was, relevant to the struggle, and he was getting rid of them. And he was changing to the point that even the organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, many of his members began to defect and go back to the Nation of Islam because they wanted that black nationalist revolution to continue. So Malcolm was also repelled by some of his closest members. Okay, so we look at a lot of those aspects. Also, the Organization for the Afro-American Unity. A lot of those members weren't pleased with Malcolm's transition to Islam. You see, they say we love the struggle, but we can't deal with the religion. So there was a lot of diversity within the inner circle that people are not privy to. So they're just seeing Malcolm on the video. They can't determine whether he's Malcolm X or El Hajj Malik Shabazz. They don't know if he's standing upon that position that he's saying, or he's discarded that and taken a different position. So there's a lot that goes into the man Malcolm X that the common person may not have privy to. And that's why I tried to cover a lot of that, in a timeline in the book, to try to show them that Malcolm reinvented himself more than one time. And what Malcolm are you embracing?
But I still need you to address, why do you think today's imam on the pulpit today, with the type of oppression that's going on? Because look, Sheikh, Muslims know Sayyid Qutb, let's say. Right? Muslims know Sayyid Qutb, and he is all the way over there in Azhar. Muslims know Hassan Banna. Muslims know Sheikh Taqiyuddin Ibhani. Muslims know, subhanAllah, Abu Ala Maududi, for instance. People know. And most of these probably still coming out from the immigrants who bought that here. And they said, you need to know these scholars, you need to know these books. But we still don't see somebody coming out writing. Now you are, and this is, I think that's why I'm calling this, I call this a unique discussion. That as much as we might quote Abu al-Maududi, or we might quote, other scholars, Israr Ahmad, for instance, we don't quote still Malcolm X in that way in our masajid, even though he would be considered, he is an indigenous scholar of this land. No one would know the struggle more than Malcolm X would know.
That's correct. One of the reasons is that the Malcolm was cut short
Mm.
his vision. So when we look at Malcolm's assassination, the revolution didn't stop. Racism didn't stop. Discrimination did not stop. In fact, Malcolm was assassinated before the signing of the Civil Rights Bill. And what happens is if you re-identify or identify with Malcolm in this day and time, you would have to pick up the banner. You would have to pick up the baton and continue that struggle. And before you do that, you would have to be educated as to what was the ultimate goal of Haj Malik Shabazz. And also, what is the nature of the environment that you live in? Because you see, there's two types of people that came to America with the exclusion of the Mayflower. Okay, we had those who came in captivity. Okay, in the belly of the ships. Okay, who their progeny was born into a state of servitude by generation after generation. Okay. And then we have those who come by way of immigration, refugees, and things of this nature. So the contrast is different. So why? So to actually engage or to venture into, the dynamics and the history of the struggle that Malcolm himself encountered and had to face, and those obstacles, which are still prevalent in our environment, it's just that we have a blind eye to them. Then you would have to change your status to address that. You would have to come out of your comfort zone to actually engage, and that requires education. So the less you know, the more comfortable you are. So I think that the invested interest in Malcolm's struggle and those people who were recipients of that, who still want to carry on that banner of social justice and equality in a so-called democracy, I think that they avoid those type of gatherings, because it's actually a commitment. It actually costly, and it may alter your status. I mean, it's just a choice that people make. And I think that a lot of times our Ummah that comes to this country are not really educated about the environment, and the administrative body and the community at large restricts them from actually venturing beyond his religious obligations as an imam to manage the affairs of the masjid, and that's why we saw very low participation from the Muslim leadership in the protests for Gaza and things like that. Whether we believe that that's effective or not, there was no vocal presence. There was no condemnation at a level that it actually spoke for the general Muslim community at large in America, because it's a matter of maintaining your comfort zone.
Sheikh, so you've studied back home. You've studied in actually many institutions back home, and you know the culture back. I mean, this is home for you, but but you've studied abroad. You know how the Muslims live. You know the cultures, and at the same time, you know the culture here. I mean, if I was to put you on the spot, which I kind of have, but top 4 or 5 things that must be done by the Muslims. And the reason I'm saying this, Sheikh, is that look, Islam is not new to this country, but the average person would still think that Islam just came. It's the immigrants who brought Islam to this country. Although the indigenous people here, whether, especially the African Americans, have played a huge role in making sure Islam is here and stays here. And to be honest, it will be the African Americans in general. I think if anything was to happen, most of the immigrants would pack up their bag and leave. But, I'm saying it from the sense that things become uncomfortable. So what role a scholar like you, someone who's writing books on these things, who is a forensics historian, who has gone through different stages of this in this country, Sheikh, to make sure that that gap that exists between the immigrants and the indigenous people here, the Muslims in general. And the reason I say that, Sheikh, let me put this kind of in perspective. I recently was in Dallas. I mean, literally, I came back a day or two ago. And it was kind of very disturbing to see. You barely see African Americans in well-off masajid, let's say. Right? I mean, I saw that in many. I visited at least 20 masajid. And I can almost say I barely saw African Americans. And that kind of, it really put me in a situation. I said, Sheikh, why that neglect? Do you think that this must be by design. This can't be, this is just happening. But this must be by design. And if you consider this by design, what do we need to do, Sheikh?
Okay, let me just tell you first about my experience in Muslim countries. Coming from America, and despite all that we have experienced in our struggles as people of color, to gain, a human status in the society, which took, decades, I find that we have Muslims there, but we lack an Islamic infrastructure. The government system, I think that we have the illusion of that there is such thing as church and state, that we have a secular and a religious, identity that can run parallel. I think this is the misunderstanding, or this is what is being misrepresented in the Muslim countries. You have the scholars have been reduced to clerics, meaning that they are only restricted to managing and monitoring the religious affairs, and what they say have no real implication or impact in governmental operations. Okay, so the
actual
affairs, decision-making policies and things of this nature. And with the decolonization of Africa, the Muslim countries followed the European template of nation states. For example, as opposed to like America have 50 states, from sea to sea, and that is the strength. That is the unity, the consolidation and solidarity of a nation. Wherein within side of Africa, we have 50 Muslim countries. We go in Arabia, we have 37 Muslim countries, but there's no solidarity. They are broken up into nation states and things of this nature. And within that, people acquire not an Islamic identity, but a national identity. And so when you have nationalism, that means you will pick up a weapon against someone who actually live across the river to what you consider your interests based on geographical dimensions. And I think that when we come to the United States of America, we actually reinvent or replicate our institutions based on what we experience in our particular homelands and things of this nature. You do have some intermixing, but most of those interactions are by default. It's like unavoidable in urban America. You have more transit communities like that, but the very foundation and the actual what we call founders of those institutions are more ethnically, the same. Okay. Now, what happens is we know the history of the so-called African American in America. He's actually in the hypo descent, put in the lowest rung of the social ladder. So sometimes in associating, with those type of people, sometimes the perception is that your status in the society may be diminished. So there's a level of avoidance. And see, like I mentioned earlier, that when you are nurtured in an environment of racism, discrimination, and culturalization, when you are nurtured in these societies, it's very easy for you to actually sense this in the communities. Of course, they will embrace you as a Muslim, okay? But when you talk about bridging the gap, unity and things of this nature, we just actually hosted a Muslim Solidarity Conference about a month ago. And we gave invitations to all the Ummah to come and participate. I think that it actually was a barometer, a measuring stick to see how many people was really concerned about the unity of the Muslims. Okay, because it was a very, very poor turnout. It was a very poor response because we are so skeptical and we are so hesitant to involve ourselves with Muslims who don't speak our language, who don't, come from our lands and things like that. We don't know the interactions, the end results of if we get involved in movements, and we've allowed infiltration at the highest level to disrupt, just basic institutional building like schools and universities. We're in the 21st century, the most progressive, advanced country in the world, but we don't have an Islamic institution that can put all of our imams on the same page, all of the students of knowledge on the same page, that we can frequent masjids and schools like we do public libraries in this society. We lack a lot in our pursuit of unity because we're being orientated. And not only that, if you go back to the picture of my father standing over the coffin of El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, you only see him standing there and one person. And because an executive order went out to the United Nations that no heads of state should actually give value to Malcolm's life, okay?
Oh, wow.
They would be very upset if they would actually support the agenda of that, what they call a dissident. So they stood off. So we have other political interests and other economic interests and social interests that we don't actually expose to the people, because it will actually expose our hypocrisy as Muslims. And it's just a lack of trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I've been to lectures, Ya Sheikh, and I've heard, prolific speakers talk about the social climate that we're in, the atrocities, but they never mention Islam as a solution. They never mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the directive legislation of his messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have actually almost removed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the guidance of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam from the narrative. You see, and we are trying to second guess our way through the society. And that's why we are falling one generation after another. And I fear the most is that within 2-3 generations down the road, will those youth that we actually bring forth, our progeny, be able to maintain their Islamic identity in the society in which we live in today?
This is okay. No, that's a topic by itself. But Sheikh, I mean, do you think, because of what you just said, can that be one of the reasons why we don't see that kind of support for Gaza and African American community?
Yes, I think that is one of the main reasons. And of course,
because they might say that we ourselves don't see their struggle. I mean, what is the truth in this, Sheikh? I'll give you, for instance, let me, I remember I gave a khutbah one time in predominantly African American masjid, and I always give khutbahs in the masajid there. But one time I remember a brother came to me and he said, "Listen, akhi, no matter what you're saying a lot of things that we understand, but you still don't see our struggle." Look, Sheikh, I mean, fine. What you just said, I just, this is something that's, you hit me with it, which you said that, look, dealing with certain, groups of people, immigrant communities might feel that, they're not, those communities are not there financially. They may actually feel like, okay, we don't belong, or they don't belong. This kind of nonsense that exists in the masajid, and I'm sure this is for sure. But on the other hand, do you think it's true that if the other side says, "Well, you don't understand our struggle"?
I think it goes both ways, and of course, I can say that I wouldn't go as far as say that the immigrants don't understand our struggle. I would say they're not willing to get involved. And of course, there's a problem with language, and that comes through nationalism, that we have allowed geographical barriers and borders to actually cause us to see ourselves as different. Because and of course, I did lectures on the Gaza situation with indicting and reprimanding the African American for not getting involved, showing them in the early stages of the social justice movement, these bridges was actually together, that we supported one another. And that was one of the plights of Hajj Malik Shabazz, to actually close that gap. And he said, it doesn't matter, your ethnicity, what country you're from, we have the same struggle. And I think that in America, I don't think that we have the same struggle. I think that we are still struggling with systemic racism and discrimination and things like that. Where now we see our immigrant brothers are actually given a pass to go to the highest prestigious universities in America and actually acquire an education that caused their life to be very easy in this capitalist society. And of course, a person would say, well, then you have the same opportunity, because, and if they say that, they don't understand the culture, that we are actually put in these places by lottery, that when you see an affluent, African-American in a higher position beyond sports and entertainment, then that's a lottery. He's chosen to be in this position or that position or a certain amount. It's called a quota, affirmative action. So that opportunity is not for every individual. And you will see that when you begin to actually circulate your wealth in a way in which it began to elevate that particular community, you will see some type of interference with that. And of course, we've been struggling for many years here, and we have not really seen, and I can't say that for myself, particularly because my father, as far as I can remember, we've always been involved in the international struggle for human rights. In the 70s, we was at the United Nations Plaza saying Palestine for the Palestinian people. I grew up in a society of diversity. There was Yemeni in our community. There was Indians and Pakistanis and Sudanese. I grew up with diversity. I grew up with that correct paradigm of Islam. Okay. However, on the outside, there were organizations that split from immigrant organizations because there was no integration. There was no real assimilation. There was real, no decision-making, sharing power inside of that. And as you mentioned, a very interesting point, that if there's going to be a change, that we would have to come in the front. And I think that was a mistake when we actually was pushed back in the back again. It's very easy to manipulate a person who don't have the resources to fend for themselves, you see? And we can actually solicit and hire our prominent personalities and give them a comfortable salary and put them to work and working for the agenda, okay, of an interest group. And there's two sides to that. And I think that they have taken some of our prominent, influential Muslim leaders, indigenous Muslims, and have utilized them outside of the urban community so that they would have no real effect on change in that society. So there's an intent, there's an ill intent there to control Islam and its growth for change. Of course, we are given permission to build our masjids in the land of Caesar, and without any reprisals, as long as we actually don't advocate a better life or change, or we don't rock the boat or ripple the waves that's in this political society in which we live in.
Sheikh, you mentioned something I want to ask you, but again, you have your opinion to this. But recently with what's happening with Imam Siraj, Mamdani, who could be the new mayor of New York, just went there, and just him visiting there. Now, the first thing is, the question comes, why now? You visit this masjid after, Masjid Taqwa has been there. I remember going to that masjid about 18, 20 years ago. And, is this what you're saying, Sheikh, that only use prominent African Americans when you need them? And then Siraj Wahaj he's a personality by himself. There is so much to be said about the brother and the amount of struggles that he's been through and what they're trying to put him through still. But is this what you mean, Sheikh, that use the personality or build personalities only for the interest, not even for the African American communities, but rather our own comforts?
Alhamdulillah, that's a good question. Imam Siraj and myself, we were classmates. Actually, we acquired our ijazahs together. And we text each other and probably twice a week, So he
knows you well. We need to bring him on the show, Sheikh.
Very well. We've
actually be interesting to have you and him on the show at the same time.
We share panels on on numerous programs about, you know, the history of America. And of course, what's unique about Imam Siraj orientation and my orientation, we come from two different orientations, okay? And we meet up at the same time, you know, and we're in the same space. And he has a story to tell, and I have a story to tell. And of course, his story is not agreeable with how, you know, because as we was growing up, the Nation of Islam was our opposition. And my father was very adamant about making it known. So we weren't on good terms. But alhamdulillah, me and Imam Siraj, we are on good terms. And of course, I look at it this way, Ya Sheikh, is that if you are labored, that labor never goes away. There's, you know, in the Muslim world, there's no expiration on the product. So, you know, and I think that, you know, Imam Siraj, my Imam, you know, has demonstrated, you know, over the years that Islam is not a threat to America. It's a compliment, you say. And the monster that y'all have painted me, y'all have seen through my work and my conviction and my devotion to Islam, that's a false image of me. He's shown, you know, and not that he had to, but he's labored. Mm-hmm. So and there's no expiration date on that labor. So when they need to actually go back in time and pull something out, you know what I'm saying, to derail, you know, a political, you know, election, then they will reach into their closet and say, what labor do we have that can discredit this particular campaign? And that's what has happened. I think that it would be wise for our Imam to actually start addressing that false narrative in the public space so that it will not be passed down from one generation to the next. So there will be a clarity about who he is, as we have become very adamant, my family, you know, following in the footsteps of our father, to really start addressing the misinformation about El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. You see, because if we do not become proactive in those areas, then that label will always be on the shelf, and they will use it whenever they can.
So, I mean, can Siraj Wahaj, Sheikh Imam Siraj, I mean, Hafidhullah, may Allah protect him, Sheikh, what do you see? I mean, I know you kind of described his role, but you're saying that he should use his role to bridge what gap, Sheikh? The gap, the political gap, or the gap between the immigrant Muslim, and because I think he can do all of that, to be honest. I mean, he has that. He's been playing a very major role in all the communities.
You know, I tell you what's lacking here is that when we look at, you see, personalities are built. Okay, exposure, you know, personalities are built. And, you know, even though you may not know it, you could be actually handpicked. You could be cherry-picked to carry out a different agenda, okay? And what happened is, you know, you don't determine whether a person should go into heavyweight until he actually perform in an amateur level. And once you're actually proficient at an amateur level, then some promoter will come to you and he see an interest in you, but he give you a protocol. So what happened is there were many people that could actually be built, that a personality could have been built out of. But they was very, very particular in their choice. You see, and me and Imam Siraj have these conversations, and a lot of times when we actually go to these events and we bump across each other, and I'm book vending, selling my books, he would say, Imam, you're not on the program? Why are you not talking about I saw something about El-Hajj Malik Shabazz there. I saw something about the history of Islam there. Why are you not on the program? You see what I'm saying? Because I'm not in that orchard. Because I have a story that they don't want to hear. I have a story to tell that they don't want to hear about Islam. They don't want to know about the 617 declassified FBI files of illegal surveillance on our organization, infiltration, integration, and restriction of growth and progress in our community, because that would show an injustice, at a high level inside of America. As we see the injustice now after the declassified FBI files that come out about Al-Hajmi Shabazz, we have access to the police records now. We have access to affidavits that was sealed and so forth. Now we're actually beginning to see the reality surrounding his assassination. It's the four circles of evil from the CIA, FBI, the NYPD down to the Nation of Islam as the chain of command trickled down. And the generations have passed. So now we absorb this as though it can't happen again. But if we look deep into what we call go deep into the rabbit hole, we will see a reoccurrence of this. And when we have just one person, they're representing, millions of Muslims, that's not healthy. We need 100, 200, 300 people, 400. Our A'immah, every A'immah should be at the level of Imam Siraj in their delivery, that we should be on the same page. And for that reason, he will not be left as a sitting duck. So who's going to come and rescue or stand behind him and as a character reference? As we know, Imam Siraj stain as an unindicted co-conspirator was based on his character reference for a particular person that was on trial. So you run the risk of being connected to something negative that will bring you out of your comfort zone. So, and of course, we have to support him. We have to stand behind him, and we should be able to see the conspiracy and the plot. You know what I'm saying? And the ill conduct. And what we call political malpractice, as they tried to undermine the campaign.
All right, Sheikh. Last two questions. I'm going to ask them together so you can address them both. Sheikh, the kind of history, you're a historian, and your ability to look at history and look at today's realities and connect them and present them is just unbelievable. I mean, and it's there. You have the books, you have the know-how, you have the Islamic background, you have the scholarship. But there's the average Muslim still doesn't know you. That's a big problem for me. And I'm actually, I consider myself unfortunate that I got to know you now in the last maybe year, 2 years, right? Sheikh, that means that there's a disservice being done because of the culture of, you can call this the celebrity culture that's being promoted, where the real intellectuals of our community, people who really know and understand, and they are being by design, let's put aside. So how do we change this, Sheikh? How do we change this culture? I mean, first of all, is it changeable? And why it's so important that we do this? If not, the gems in our community, our society, Sheikh, we won't know them. But what we are knowing, and here's the second part. So please don't forget the first one. Second part, even those who are addressing us, they address us. They're amazing historians. Let's say they know how to really they can they're good speakers. They know how to engage. They really know how to But the kind of topics or kind of history that's given to us is irrelevant to us today. Or even if it's relevant, they don't know how to connect it and present it. Like you said, Islam is the solution for this country. Malcolm X said, Islam is the only thing that can solve the problem of racism in this country. So what do we do here, Sheikh? And we are if not, we're like what you were saying, that we're at a point where we may lose our coming generations.
The first question, I think that I'm privileged to have met someone like you at this time in my life.
Jazakallah khair. Wallah, I really did. When I came back to New York, Chicago, the whole way back, Sheikh, we were saying, how is it that we missed somebody like this? And I'm sure that we have so many like you, Sheikh, that they're not speaking. They're not the ones that are out there. So, and that celebrity culture, please address this.
And I think that, again, I see my father, he worked for the Muslim World League for 15 years. the Rabita al-Islamiyya, Muslim World League. And also, he was the press attaché for Islamic Press International for another 50 years. So my father was involved in everybody that came through. We know how they came to America. We know the funding process of all of these institutions. In fact, we had what we call the Rabita tapes. That's about 500 actually recordings that my father did on heads of states and things like that. He traveled into 83 Muslim countries. And those files were denied to us upon his demise. They would not give us his works, okay? Because we had so much information inside of the Rabita tapes that if we were able to actually expound upon them today, it would show a real major shift in the direction that Islam was going. And, I had the privilege, Ya Sheikh, to live with the Mashayikh, and of course, there's two narratives. There's one you say in public and there's one you say in private. And of course, a lot of information that was shared with me was confidential. And even at this point, I've held a lot of confidential information back, and I actually see it unroll, and that's why I'm so astute and so inquisitive as to how things play out, because I have foreknowledge based on other people involved in that particular area. And why have a person like myself have not been discovered or have not been put on, the major platforms is because, as I said before, in all honesty, I have a story that would actually reshape, the perception of Islam in America.
It would reshape the whole narrative.
Yes. And one thing that is you have to be very aware of is that America, is a society that tries to facilitate all religious expressions at any level. And of course, if you have the numbers and the political clout and the influence, then you can actually polish up anyone. At Malcolm was suppressed for 50 years as anti-American, black nationalist, hate monger, etc. So and now Malcolm is coming back as now one of our prominent civil rights leaders. But when he was in that space, he was one of the most rejected. So how he become one of the most rejected and now he become one of the most, we have to understand that. Not only that is that
because you can say even I'm sorry, just so I don't forget. I guess that dynamic also happened between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, where you have somebody being given a platform and the other one is being denied.
Yes, yeah, I think Malcolm. He was given a platform in the very early stages of his life, but when he came back from the pilgrimage, he had to recreate his own platform. And if you look at the timeline, he only survived 11 months. After Malcolm made the pilgrimage, he was assassinated with less than a year. So that should tell you a lot. But 10 years prior, So what happened is when Dr. King began to break protocol, this is a whole nother history I'm going to do on the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. He began to break protocol. He began to speak about the war in Vietnam. He began to speak about issues of injustice and hypocrisy of democracy and things of this nature. And of course, the fear of him choosing another narrative, versus the one that we were under here became a threat because, he was labeled by the FBI as a communist and things of this nature. And of course, Dr. King was actually kind of fed up with turning the other cheek. He was beginning to reshape his views about, is this the way that we're going to achieve our social justice, things of this nature? And of course, they began to write Dr. King's speeches that he didn't have the liberty to speak from his own volition, from his own, assessments and things of this nature.
And I didn't know this. Oh, wow.
And in fact, he was getting ready to resign from SNCC, from those organizations. He was beginning to become what we call a maverick. And of course, you can read the book of As the Walls Come Tumbling Down by Ralph Abernathy, who was actually second in charge, how they were in conflict and actually how to present the civil rights agenda. So there's a lot that went on in the inner circle of the FBI, surveillance over Dr. King, actually trying to entrap him and charge him with infidelity and all of these other things to discredit the civil rights movement. Actually, they wanted Dr. King out the way, okay, because he was becoming a problem, okay? He was too strong, okay? And the fear of El-Hajj Malik Shabazz in his new direction, aligning with Dr. King would have been explosive. And and you see the historical photo. There was only a meet inside of Washington, D.C. They never had any other conversation beyond that. And of course, Malcolm visited Coretta Scott and went to Georgia numerous times, but he only talked to his wife. Every time we go, Dr. King, for some reason, was in jail. They actually prevented them from actually coming into the same space. So there's a lot of unwritten realities that really need to be revisited so that we can get a clarity. Now, how do we take people like myself who's actually, and again, I don't see this as history. I see it as an ongoing experience. Okay. Anything that's 70 years plus, I'm like actually in that particular wave, you see? So it's very easy for me what I do when I do my research, Ya Sheikh, is that I'm really looking for confirmation. I'm really looking for dates, time, places. I understand the events that transpired. My father.
You've been there. You just need the dates to put it on the spot.
Yes. Like I said, all of those, many of those people who were involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Al-Hajj Shabazz, they defected from the Nation of Islam. They defected from the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and they came to my father's house, and they would sit down and they would confide in him, okay, things that transpired, very confidential. And of course, even when they had problems with after Malcolm assassination, it was my father who appointed James Small as the imam for the Muslim Mosque Incorporated because he was neutral in the conflict. So, and my father was also a very close friend for Ella Collins, Malcolm's sister. He was one of her advisors, or religious advisors, because my father was 30 years ahead of them with Islamic education. And of course, when he would visit her in Boston, my brother, Imam Ali, he would actually sleep in Malcolm's bed. And we have actually managed the religious affairs for the Shabazz family for years, but we are actually cut out of the picture when it comes to representing Al-Hajj Shabazz. And that's a whole nother program that we will have to talk about in a different light, inshallah.
Well, I mean, even we didn't finish the book, but time.
Yes. So, of course, we have to come back and do another segment.
No, we will, Sheikh. So, subhanAllah, I mean, this is... wow. There is so much, I mean, because we still have to talk about the end of the book. We're maybe the first 2-3 chapters of this situation, Sheikh. So, inshallah, Sheikh, I know I said it was the last question. One more question. That's it. And then you can end it this way. Sheikh, how old Malcolm was in his 60s, rahmatullah alayh, when he was killed? No? Or how old was Malcolm X?
39.
39? 39 years old. Oh, subhanallah. I never, subhanallah, 39 years old when he was killed.
1925. Yes. My father was 32 when he did the janazah.
Allahu Akbar. See, that I had no idea. So this is a young man and with an amazing, Sheikh, wow, subhanallah. So, Sheikh, and he's 39 years old, who is doing things. That was a shocking. I didn't know he was 39. I really thought he was in his 50s or 60s when he was killed. Rahmatullah alayh. Sheikh, what does Malcolm X represent today?
Malcolm X represents today he represents actually manhood and strength. He represents conviction. He's a very sincere person. If you follow his life, how he made his transitions. And I say that because, Malcolm took the Shahadah, meaning the official recognition of April 8, 1964. Okay. And that was the year of Hajj. So he went to Hajj. However, when Malcolm took the Shahadah, he still had some reservations about totally denouncing the doctrine or the theology of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm, in his own words, said when he was standing in the sacred precincts of Mecca, in the Ihram, that I had to make a decision whether I was going to continue to follow that which Elijah Muhammad was teaching, or I was going to follow what Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam of Arabia. And I have his vocal saying, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And he made that was his epiphany. He made a conscientious decision at that point, because when he left the Muslims Incorporated to travel to Mecca, he left as Malcolm X, the Black nationalist, the Pan-Africanist, and also still connected to the theology of the Nation of Islam. When he came back, he was surprised to his own people. That's why in his letter, he says, you may be surprised at me for what I'm saying in this letter, because this is a transition that they weren't aware of. And James 67X, who was second in charge, concealed the letter from the congregation for 6 days because he was afraid that they had lost their Malcolm. So when Malcolm came back to his very organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, he met opposition. And at that point, many of those people that were there, they defected and went back to the Nation of Islam. So this is something that is very relevant in Malcolm's transition, that it was a conscientious choice. It wasn't like when Imam Wajdi Muhammad made the transition, everybody followed for a while, and then some went back to with Minister Louis Farrakhan and things of this nature. It was more or less like a herd type, transition. You have to decide within that format, within that formula, whether you're going to hang on and perfect your Islam, or whether you're going to actually go back. But with Malcolm, it was actually what we call a metamorphosis. He actually transcended at that point. And that's important. And that's why we have to separate the Malcolm X in the sense of the theology of the Nation of Islam from the El-Hajj Malik Shabazz.
And with that, brothers and sisters, also my own message to the brothers, especially young brothers and sisters, I think it's very important that we pick up the books and we need to read who Malcolm X is. So many of the youth today are looking for what you mentioned, manhood, character, standing up for something that's important, having a purpose in life, especially in today's time where so many of us are looking at the injustices and tyranny and oppression that's taking place, and we're looking for examples. And for those born and raised, even in the US, you might say, hey, there's scholars from back home, they're so-and-so, but here's Malcolm X, someone who saw the realities of what these things mean, and he started addressing them, and he did the work that needs to be done in order to address real issues, real problems, not stories. So, Sheikh, with that, Jazakallah khair for your time. Inshallah, we're going to have, we have to have second part, because I also want to discuss with you even Martin Luther King, just to see what your experiences were. Because obviously you saw the whole different phases of him also and what he went through. So, Sheikh, Jazakallah khair for your time. We hope and pray that really that this conversation is heard throughout the world, actually, inshallah, from Pakistan, Afghanistan, here in the US, all over. Even the last conversation we had, thousands of people heard that across the world. So, and then once the book comes out, we'll make sure to put that out there. So the name of the book is Why Malcolm Was Really Killed. Right, inshallah. And we'll put that link underneath this. Let me know when it actually comes out, Sheikh, so that we can put that link so that people can actually purchase it.
Yes, I'll do that. And last, I wanted to say this. One unique characteristic of El-Hajj Malik Shabazz was sacrifice. And that sacrifice was not just for him. That sacrifice entailed his entire family. That they actually, his wife, especially Bahia, Hajja Bahia, who actually made Hajj the month after he was assassinated, and she was pregnant with twins. And she said if it was Hajj, she don't think that she would have been able to bear that despair, you see, and he sacrificed his all.
Yeah, subhanallah, without sacrifice, there's no meaning to life. All right, Shaykhi, Jazakallah khair, and we'll see you next time. Again, barakallah feek for your time and your efforts, and may Allah continue to give you the tawfiq and the strength that is needed to continue writing these books and speaking to people like us. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.